To access all audiobook recordings without ad interruptions, please visit the links below. Thank you for your support. Bloodlands by Grover Furr. Chapter 5. Examining Snyder's Claim of National Terror in Bloodlands Chapter 3. In Chapter 3 of Bloodlands, Snyder turns to the Azovchina of 1937 to 1938, and specifically the Polish operation, Nikolai Azov's mass murders of Soviet citizens of Polish descent. Snyder also discusses the NKVD campaign against Polish espionage and the Polish military organization. Snyder's account is completely false. This is partly due to Snyder's deliberate falsifications and withholding of evidence from his readers. Without doubt, it is also due in part to Snyder's ignorance of Soviet history. It seems clear that Snyder has never devoted any serious study to the extremely important issue of the illegal mass murders called the Azovchina. A full history of the Azovchina is beyond the scope of this book. We can state that all the evidence available to researchers today confirms that the mass murders, and especially the national operations against persons of various nationalities, were part of the conspiracy by Nikolai Azov to maximize discontent with the Soviet system and so facilitate uprisings in the wake of any invasion of the USSR by hostile powers such as Germany or Japan. Footnote: see Furr, The Moscow Trials and the Great Terror of 1937 to 1938, What the Evidence Shows, cited in the last chapter. End of footnote. This chapter of Bloodlands is of sufficient interest that we will deal with most of it in the body of this book. In the following chapter, we'll discuss a few aspects of the Azovchina in more depth, and also point out some falsifications in a few of Snyder's published articles. Another falsification by Snyder. Quote, "People belonging to national minorities should be forced to their knees and shot like mad dogs." It was not an SS officer speaking, but a Communist Party leader, in the spirit of the national operations of Stalin's Great Terror. End quote, page 89. Snyder's note to this passage, note 1, page 47. Martin, Origins, which Snyder claims brings analytical rigor to the national operations. Quotation, Jansen, Executioner, page 96. See also Baborowski, Terror, page 197. Footnote: Martin Origins is in fact an overview of Soviet ethnic policy, but it is composed from the materials available in the mid-1990s, when a great many important primary sources on the Azovchina had not yet been published, and so it is of limited usefulness today. End of footnote. The quotation is actually in Jansen and Petrov, page 98, at note 96. It reads as follows. In the words of Krasnozarsky, Province Party Secretary Sobolev, "Stop playing internationalism. All these Poles, Koreans, Latvians, Germans, etc. should be beaten. These are all mercenary nations, subject to termination. All nationals should be caught, forced to their knees, and exterminated like mad dogs." This may have been an exaggeration, but after Azov's fall, he was accused of this by the Krasnoyarsky State Security Organs Party Organization. By giving such instructions, Sobolev slandered the VKPB and Comrade Stalin in saying that he had such instructions from the Central Committee and Comrade Stalin personally. The revised and updated Russian version of 2007 reads similarly. The words of the original edition, "This may have been an exaggeration," are omitted in the later Russian edition. No doubt this omission is intended to lend a more anti-communist flavor to the passage. Petrov is a leading figure in the Memorial Society, a fervently anti-communist organization, and Petrov's publications on Soviet history, tendentious and full of vituperation, cannot be trusted. Once again, Snyder is misleading his readers here. He claims that this statement was in the spirit of the national operations of Stalin's Great Terror, but the very quotation he cites says precisely the opposite of this, that this statement was slander, see above. Jansen and Petrov henceforth J&P, inform us that this statement is an accusation made against Sobolev during the investigations, arrests, and prosecutions against Ezhov and his men. Their footnote is to an archival document in Ezhov's files. In fact, we only know about the statement at all because of this investigation. It is attributed to Sobolev by his accusers, Beria's men, who were working to investigate and prosecute Ezhov's massive crimes. They and Beria were, of course, doing so at the behest of Stalin and the Soviet leadership. Jansen and Petrov, both extremely anti-communist and anti-Stalin writers, admit that the NKVD claim that Sobolev made this statement may have been an exaggeration, but Snyder does not inform his readers of this fact, nor was it, in Snyder's words, Stalin's great terror. On the contrary, it was Ezhov's. Ezhov and hundreds of his men were investigated, prosecuted, and many of them executed because the massacres they committed were not authorized by Stalin or the Soviet Party or government. Later in this chapter, we cite some of the relevant evidence. Another lie by Georg Babarowski. The second reference Snyder cites here, Babarowski, Ter 198, falsifies just as flagrantly as does Snyder. Babarowski claims that Ezhov said, "The Poles must be completely annihilated." Babarowski's own footnote to this paragraph gives two references. Zeitert in Suvirnov, Tragedia S. 208, Jansen, Petrov, Stalin's Loyal Executioner, S. 98. Anyone who checks these sources will discover that the supposed quote from Ezhov is Babarowski's own creation, a fabrication. Neither Suvirnov nor J&P documents it. It would not be surprising if Ezhov did say it or something like it, since it is consistent with his conspiracy. But Babarowski does not say that it would be logical for Ezhov to have said it. He says that Ezhov did say it, therefore he is lying. Babarowski frequently falsifies as he does here. Several years ago, I wrote an article about another example of his dishonesty, Babarowski's falsification. Footnote, Grover Furr, Babarowski's falsification. End of footnote. But Snyder is responsible for this lie as well. It is a historian's duty to verify the fact claims he cites, as we are doing in the case of Snyder's book. This is a circular citation, a reference that simply refers again to materials that Snyder has already cited. The Jansen-Petrov reference is to the same passage Snyder has also cited, dishonestly. Suvirnov, Tragedia RKKA, 1937 to 1938, page 208. Quotes from interrogations of Ezhov's men by Beria's men, in other words, the investigation of Ezhov's unauthorized mass murders undertaken by Beria at the instigation of the Politburo and, of course, of Stalin. Neither Snyder nor any of the sources he cites here tell their readers that such evidence as they have come from the prosecutions of Ezhov's men and Ezhov himself for massive illegal repressions. All these authors, Snyder, Jansen/Petrov, Babarowski, and Suvirnov, deliberately give the impression that this was official Soviet policy sanctioned by Stalin and the Politburo, when in reality the opposite was the case. The case of the Polish military organization. The Polish operation was part of Ezhov's mass murder campaign. Snyder seriously falsifies it. He writes, Stalin was a pioneer of national mass murder, and the Poles were the preeminent victim among the Soviet nationalities. This is false. The national mass murder was Ezhov's. Snyder continues. The Polish national minority, like the kulaks, had to take the blame for the failures of collectivization. The rationale was invented during the famine itself in 1933 and then applied during the Great Terror in 1937 and 1938. In 1933, the NKVD chief for Ukraine, Vyacheslav Belitsky, had explained the mass starvation as a provocation of an espionage cabal that he called the Polish military organization. According to Belitsky, this Polish military organization had infiltrated the Ukrainian branch of the Communist Party and backed Ukrainian and Polish nationalists who sabotaged the harvest and then used the starving bodies of Ukrainian peasants as anti-Soviet propaganda. It had supposedly inspired a nationalist Ukrainian military organization, a doppelganger performing the same fell work and sharing responsibility for the famine. Pages 89 through 90, source note 2, page 5471. For greater detail on the Polish line, see Snyder's sketches, 115 to 132. Snyder is wrong. We showed in the first chapter that Belitsky did not explain the mass starvation as a provocation of Polish military intelligence or of any other organization. Footnote. Snyder uses Belitsky a Ukrainian spelling. Another more accurate transliteration of the Ukrainian would be Balyts''Kyy, though almost all the sources we have concerning him are in Russian. I will use the Russian spelling Balitskii. End of footnote. And of course, Snyder does not cite any evidence that he did. Snyder cites Chapter 6 of his own book, Sketches from a Secret War, A Polish Artist's Mission to Liberate Soviet Ukraine, pages 115 to 132. In this work, Snyder documents the fact that Polish espionage really did exist in the USSR during the 1930s. Footnote. It is possible that the Polish military intelligence no longer referred to itself as the POW, the Polish acronym for the Polish Military Organization, although some of these arrested as Polish spies had been in the POW and referred to the Polish underground intelligence as the POW. End of footnote. In Sketches, but not in Bloodlands, Snyder admits that Polish spies were active in the USSR in the 1930s. The hero of this book, Henryk Jozowski, ran some of them, and that some of these spies were indeed active within the Polish Communist Party. For example, he writes, these and similar sources, such as the records of the counterintelligence sections of the Polish Army's field commands, can now be read in a different light. They suggest the degree of Polish penetration of the Soviet Union in the late 1920s and the early 1930s, and the political design that lay behind the border crossings, the sabotage, and the support of local nationalists. Jozowski's Volhynia experiment united these two goals, supporting Ukrainian culture in Poland while serving as a base for espionage operations within the Soviet Union. By 1932, the work of the Lwow Command brought measurable results. In March, it could boast 61 active agents and missions in the GPU in Proskuriv, Yampol, Sheptykiva, and Kamenets, Politsky, in the Dniester Fleet, and in the Kiev and Kharkiv garrisons of the Red Army, page 89. Many more such quotations from Snyder's sketches could be cited. In the one confession statement by Witold Wonderski, now available to scholars and cited by Snyder in Sketches, but not in Bloodlands, Wonderski says concerning his Polish communist contacts working in the USSR, in the course of my contacts with these people, I realized that I was dealing with people who were playing a double role. On the one hand, they held high positions in the party. On the other, they were staunch Pilsudski supporters. Wonderski outlines the way he himself was torn between his desire for social reform, which drew him towards the Communist Party and resulted in his being arrested several times in Poland, and his Polish nationalism. Due to his close relations with Polish nationalists, he was finally drawn into subversive work in the USSR. Quote, as for Grant, after my conversations and dealing with him, I did not have even the shadow of a doubt that he retained the beliefs of a POW member, and he drew me into the ranks of the POW for later work in the USSR. So when in 1929 I came to the USSR, I was already fundamentally, though not formally, a member of the POW. End quote. As these passages prove, Snyder is perfectly aware that Polish espionage was a real threat in the USSR at this time, but he withholds this information from his readers and pretends that there was no such threat. See below. Snyder gives no evidence at all that Belitsky explained the mass starvation as a result of espionage. This section of Snyder's paragraph appears to be a falsification of his own invention. The Polish Military Organization, PMO. Note, the PMO is often referred to as the POW and PVO, Polish and Russian abbreviations respectively for Polish Military Organization. Snyder's chief falsification in this section is his statement that the PMO no longer existed and therefore was an invention by the Soviet NKVD. He states, this was a historically inspired invention. There was no Polish military organization during the 1930s, in Soviet Ukraine or anywhere else. It had once existed back during the Polish-Bolshevik War of 1919 to 1920 as a reconnaissance group for the Polish army. The Polish military organization had been overmastered by the Cheka and was dissolved in 1921. Belitsky knew the history since he had taken part in the deconspiracy and the destruction of the Polish military organization back then. Page 90. This is a particularly bizarre falsehood by Snyder, since many sources, including some Snyder himself cites in his book Sketches, document the continued existence of the PMO. We shall demonstrate this below. Snyder then claims that during the 1930s, Polish espionage in the USSR played no political role, i.e. was impotent. Quote, in the 1930s, Polish spies played no political role in Soviet Ukraine. They lacked the capacity to do so even in 1930 and 1931 when the USSR was most vulnerable and they could still run agents across the border. They lacked the intention to intervene after the Soviet-Polish Non-Aggression Pact was initiated in January 1932. After the famine, they generally lost any remaining confidence about their ability to understand the Soviet system, much less change it. Polish spies were shocked by the mass starvation when it came and unable to formulate a response. Precisely because there was no real Polish threat in 1933, Belitsky had been able to manipulate the symbols of Polish espionage as he wished. This was typical Stalinism. It was always easier to exploit the supposed actions of an organization that did not exist. End quote. Sources, note 3, page 471, Snyder Sketches 115 to 116. The Polish military organization idea seems to have originated in 1929 when a Soviet agent was placed in charge of the Security Commission of the Communist Party of Poland. Snyder refers to Stronsky, Reprise, 210. Snyder claims that this was a historically inspired invention and that there was no Polish military organization are false. Not only did the PMO exist during the 1930s, it continued to exist in the 1940s under German occupation. In 1942, German intelligence considered the PMO to be the largest continuing Polish threat in Nazi-occupied Lithuania. Quote, from the report of Operative Group A of the Security Police concerning the situation in the Baltics, Belarusia, and the Leningrad Oblast for the period from October 16, 1941 to January 31st, 1942. 3. Lithuania, of the Polish secret organizations, still active during Soviet times today. We have evidence of the existence of the following. 1. PMO, Polish military organization. 2. Młoda Polska, Young Poland. 3. TSVP, the Union of Free Poles. And 4. The Bloc of Fighting Poland. These organizations, for the most part, are led by former officers. However, Polish priests are widely represented in their leadership as well. The main organization is the PMO. It gives units military training and prepares them for partisan warfare. Source, RGVAF 500K, Berlin, Op 4D92, IL 120 to 147. Snyder's bizarre claim that no PMO existed after the early 1920s can, I think, only be explained if we assume that Snyder believed A, his readers will be too ignorant of the history of this period to realize how incompetent or dishonest his statement really is, and B, those researchers who might know it will be too anti-communist to expose such a useful anti-communist falsehood. Snyder cites his own book, Sketches, pages 115 to 116, where he describes the beginning of the POV equals PMO case, evidently as outlined by his secondary sources, but Snyder presents no evidence that the PMO had ceased to exist in 1921, was a historically inspired invention, no longer existed, etc., nor that there was no real Polish threat. In reality, there can be no such evidence in principle. Any country with a secret military espionage service in an enemy country would surely deny its existence. Therefore, such a denial would not constitute evidence worthy of attention that the group did not in fact exist. But Snyder does not even cite any official Polish denial of the PMO's existence. The reference Snyder cites here, Stronsky, Reprise 210, states that the Polish Communist Party was riven by fights and splits. In 1929, Viktor Zytowski, a Polish immigrant to the USSR and an employee of the GPU, was appointed head of a security commission for the party by its Politburo. In 1934, Zytowski announced the discovery of a PMO cell in the Polish party's leadership. Stronsky cites no evidence that this charge was false. In fact, the evidence now available strongly suggests the contrary, as we shall see. We have a great deal of testimony concerning the existence and activities of the PMO. Quote, The Polish military organization Belitsi had argued back in summer 1933 had smuggled into the Soviet Union countless agents who pretended to be communists fleeing persecution in their Polish homeland. The arrests of Polish political immigrants in the Soviet Union began in July 1933. The Polish communist playwright Witold Wenderski was jailed in August 1933 and forced to confess to participation in the Polish military organization. With this link between Polish communism and Polish espionage documented in interrogation protocols, more Polish communists were arrested in the USSR. The Polish communists, Jerzy Sochacki, left a message in his own blood before jumping to his death from a Moscow prison in 1933. I am faithful to the party to the end. Page 90. Sources. Note 4, page 472. Stronsky, Reprej, 211 to 213. On Sochacki, see Kaczynski, Reprej, 202. For further details on Wenderski, see Shore, Caviar, and Ashes. At least one important Polish communist did return from the Soviet Union and work for the Poles. His book is Regula Historia. Stronsky, Reprej, 211 to 213 simply summarizes the PMO conspiracy, especially in the Ukraine, that the NKVD had allegedly uncovered, including alleged contacts with Ukrainian nationalists. Stronsky does not claim that the conspiracy was fabricated by the GPU, did not exist, etc. Kaczynski, Reprej, 202. This essay was published in 1989. It is basically a list of information that was known or merely suspected, since little documentation is given about the fates of the members of the Central Committee of the Polish Communist Party. At that time, in 1989, virtually none of the Soviet archival materials now available had been made public. Therefore, aside from a few bits of biographical information, the Kaczynski article is outdated and useless. Snyder must have known this, but it is unlikely that his readers will know it. Much more information about Sochacki is now available. We discuss it more fully below. As for Marcy Shore in Caviar and Ashes, she simply assumes, without evidence, that Wenderski was innocent. This is an invalid assumption in principle. A scholar should always require evidence. Moreover, there is a lot of other evidence concerning Wenderski too. One confession of Wenderski's has been published. Wenderski is also named by others, who were arrested and confessed to espionage for Poland. In his earlier book, Sketches, Snyder cites the one published confession of Witold Wenderski, in which Wenderski states that he was indeed recruited to the POW. So already in 1929 I left for the USSR, being prepared for practical work with the POW, although Bratowski, Wróblewski, and Wojciechowski did not use that term in their talks with me. Snyder deceives his readers concerning the Polish communist Jerzy Sochacki by omitting the evidence that Sochacki really was a Polish spy. In Sketches, Snyder writes, in November 1933, a Polish officer in Kiev implied in a report to his superior that the communist Jerzy Sochacki, arrested that summer, was working for Polish intelligence. Snyder then adds the following remark: it is perhaps worthy of note that the Second Department's information about Jan Beluski, the representative of the Polish Party in the Communist International, was much more precise. Snyder knows, but hides from his readers, that Sochacki was named as a leader of PMO work within the USSR in detailed confession statements by Wenderski. For example, quote, throughout the period of our contacts, Grant was cautiously and gradually preparing me to work for the POW, which ended up by my being drawn into the activities of this organization. Grant was one of the people closest to Bratowski, equals Sochacki, and told him about my being drawn into the POW. This became clear to me after several meetings with Bratkowski, during which ambiguously emphasized that he was satisfied with the arrangement between me and Grant, end quote. In the recent document collection, Sprava POV v Ukraini, 1920 to 1938, RR, The Case of the PMO in Ukraine, 1920 to 1938. Sochacki is named by one of those arrested as a leader of the Moscow branch of the POW, along with Wanderski and others. The leadership center of the Polish military organization on Soviet terrain is situated in Moscow. Formerly it was in Kiev, then in Minsk. Among its members, Sochaki Bratowski, former secretary of the PPS equals Polish Socialist Party, agent of the 2nd Section of the Polish General Staff, was directly connected to the chief of the 2nd Division of Military Counterintelligence, Wojciechowski, head of the Polish sector in the Marx-Engels-Lenin Institute. Wanderski, former member of the PKK Polish Communist Party, writer, former director of the Polish Theater in Kiev, and others. Page 197. Sochaki is named many times in the various interrogations. Footnote. See pages 198, 200, 201, 202, 203, 204, 209, 210, 216, 217, 218, 225, 241, 249, 268, 270, 271, 272, 286, 87, 88, 89, 90, 293, 296, 298, 308, 312, 316, 354, and 408. End of footnote. In his published interrogation, Wanderski names Sochaki as well, page 503. Both Sochaki and Wanderski, along with many others, are named in interrogations of others accused of PMO activities in 1933, published in 2010. The unavoidable implication of all this evidence is this: Sochaki was indeed a leader of Polish espionage for military intelligence. The name PVO, the Russian abbreviation for Polish Military Organization, is the one uniformly used in all these documents. Whether the official name for this service, if it had one at all, was still PMO or not, would appear to make no difference. As for Snyder's claim that the Polish military organization had been shut down in 1921, here is what Wanderski had to say in his confession, cited above. Quote, "But even after his second arrest, Skarżynski was not exposed and went to Poland, where in 1922 I accidentally met him in Warsaw in one of the cafes. He was pleased with our meeting and passionately told me about working in the ranks of the POW in the Soviet Ukraine." End quote. The continued existence of the PMO is cited many times in the published interrogations and in NKVD reports now available. How likely is it that all of them could have been forged or otherwise faked? At any rate, as with any historical statement, such a forgery cannot be simply assumed as Snyder does. It would have to be supported with evidence. But it is very likely that a clandestine military intelligence espionage organization would keep its existence secret and undeniable. Therefore, there is no reason to assert, as Snyder does, that the PMO no longer existed. In his study of the Comintern's during the 1930s, William Chase records Beluski's report to the Executive Committee of the Communist International, ECCI, about the dangers of infiltration by Polish intelligence of the Communist Party. Footnote. William Chase, Enemies Within the Gates, The Comintern and the Stalinist Repression, 1934 to 1939, New Haven, Connecticut, Yale University Press, 2001, end of footnote. Quote, on September 4th, Beluski wrote a top-secret document entitled On the Issue of the Crisis of the Leadership of the CPP that focused on the dangers posed by fascists, reactionaries, and their agents, especially the Trotskyists. In light of the alleged dangers, he asserted that the destruction of these counter-revolutionary elements by the NKVD under the direction of Comrade Yezhov is a necessary act of self-defense. According to Beluski, the arrested leaders of the CPP pursued an immigration policy designed to penetrate agents of the Polish military organization into the USSR, after listing and decrying the party leadership's errors, which dated back to 1919, and its repeated failure to promote workers' causes. He recommended that the healthy elements carry out a complete reorganization of the party and its leadership and enhance its ties to the masses. End quote. Chase expressed skepticism about the charges in Beluski's report and suggests that Beluski's arrest a week later was unfounded. Quote, as fantastic as this conspiratorial explanation seems, It was the assumption upon which Yezhov's NKVD built its case against present and former leaders of the CPP, including Belusky, who was arrested a week after writing his report. The NKVD's assumption became the ECCI's conclusion, end quote. Evidently, the NKVD's suspicions of Belusky were correct, and Belusky was on the ECCI, Executive Committee of the Communist International, the highest Comintern body. This is evidence of Polish espionage at the highest levels. Chase prints the notes, ordered by Georgy Dimitrov, head of the Comintern, of the confession of Julian Linsky, another high-ranking Polish CP member, concerning the investigation of the Polish Communist Party, 226 to 273. Along with many others, Belusky is named as a Polish spy. Quote, "We also agreed on using Czechowski, Belusky, Redens, Maislaw Bernstein, and Mike Samoisky. We used the first three and planted them in the Comintern." 271. I suggested appointing the following individuals who were POW members to the Verification Commission: Prochniak, Skolsky, Belusky, Bortnowski, Krajewski. Page 272, end quote. Snyder cites no evidence disproving the existence of the PMO. Soviet NKVD reports do document clandestine Polish spies, some of whom confessed to being members of the PMO. Thus there is no evidence that Vandersky, Belusky, or any of the others was forced to falsely confess, as implied by Snyder's phrase, "forced to confess." Bloodlands, page 90. Stronsky, too, claims that Sochaki was forced to confess, page 210, but Stronsky also fails to cite any evidence that this was so. Shore, whose book Snyder cites here, also affirms that Vandersky was forced to make a false confession, but also without any evidence. Use of such language as forced to confess implies that the confession was fabricated. In fact, none of these authors has any evidence that it was Vandersky's confession that was false. According to William Chase, Sochaki was denounced as a police provocateur by the Politburo of the Polish Communist Party. Quote, "On 10th of October, Osip Panetsky sent to Lazar Kaganovich, a VKB Politburo member and one of Stalin's staunchest allies, a draft declaration by the Central Committee of the Polish CP asserting that Sochaki was a provocateur. Jan Belusky, a.k.a. Jan Paisan, was a member of the Politburo of the Polish CP, and he composed the declaration." Page 119, end quote. Chase gives the political context for these suspicions on page 118 FF. It was not a case of being suspicious of Poles, but of the heterogeneous origins and history of the Polish CP. Snyder does mention the Soviet agent in the Polish CP. Chase has more to say about this man, Mickiewicz Kaputskas. Quote, "An early May 1929 report from Mickiewicz Kaputskas provided material to support that suspicion. Entitled The Work of Polish Wreckers, the report expressed concern over the growth of factionalism and the increasing influence of former Mensheviks within the Polish CP. It asserted that a wide network of provocateurs had weakened the party's ability to function, and that Polish police had hamstrung many organs of the CPWU and CPWB, end quote, page 118, footnote, Communist Party of Western Ukraine and Communist Party of Western Belarusia, end of footnote. Even Snyder suggests that at least one Polish communist was or became a Polish spy. The Comintern suspected many more than this. At least some of them confessed. Chase's study provides much more evidence about these suspicions, as we have seen. Those allegations that we can now check against published primary documents appear to be true. It is clear from the documents Chase quotes that the initiative for such suspicions came from the Comintern leadership. Stalin was reacting to them, not initiating them. More falsehoods by Snyder about Polish espionage. Quote, Yezhov followed Belitsky's anti-Polish campaign in Soviet Ukraine, and then reconceptualized it. As the show trials began in Moscow in 1936, Yezhov drew his subordinate Belitsky into a trap. While prominent communists confessed in Moscow, Belitsky was reporting from Kiev that the Polish military organization had been recreated in Soviet Ukraine. No doubt he simply wished to claim attention and resources for himself and his local apparatus at a time of security panic. Yet now, in a turn of events that must have surprised Belitsky, Yezhov declared that the Polish military organization was in even greater danger than Belitsky claimed. It was a matter not for the regional NKVD in Kiev, but for the central NKVD in Moscow. Belitsky, who had invented the plot of the Polish military organization, now lost control of the story. Soon, a confession was extracted from the Polish communist Thomas Dobel, who claimed to have directed the Polish military organization in the entire Soviet Union. End quote. Pages 91 to 92. Sources, Note 7, page 427. Stronsky, Reprej, 227. Snyder, Sketches, 119 to 120. Neither of these sources provides any evidence for the statements in this paragraph. Stronsky, Reprej, 227, concerns events in 1938. None of the matters in this paragraph are discussed there. Snyder, Sketches, 119 to 120, outlines the investigation and suppression of the PMO espionage within the USSR during the mid-1930s. Snyder has no evidence whatsoever to sustain his repeated claim that there was no such espionage and that those who were arrested, named by others, confessed, etc., as Polish spies, were not guilty. But instead of acknowledging this fact, Snyder uses argument by quotation mark, putting scare quotes around everything he would like his readers to believe is false. This is a form of the logical fallacy of begging the question, assuming that which ought to be proven. Snyder's claim that the PMO did not exist and was a falsification by the NKVD itself is a falsification, an attempt to mislead his readers. As we have shown above, Snyder himself in his earlier book Sketches acknowledges the seriousness of Polish espionage inside the USSR in the 1930s. Moreover, Snyder cites materials in that book that document Polish spies confessing to participation in the PMO. We have also cited the recent Ukrainian book about the PMO in the USSR and a German intelligence document of 1942 that states that the PMO was the most active Polish underground organization in Nazi-occupied Lithuania at the time. Snyder, like Stronsky, assumes that Dombel, Russian spelling of Dobel, was innocent, forced to confess. This is begging the question again, assuming that which should be proven. There is no evidence that Dombel was forced to falsely confess. We do have one confession of Dombel's dated January 16, 1937, Lubyanka 1937 to 1938, number 5. Dombel was arrested on December 29, 1936. We also have two very detailed reports by Yezhov concerning the Polish operation, Lubyanka 1937 to 1938, numbers 167 and 200. Belitsky is not mentioned in any of them. Snyder continues, quote, thanks to Yezhov's initiative, the Polish military organization lost any residue of its historical and regional origins, and became simply a threat to the Soviet Union as such. On 16 January 1937, Yezhov presented his theory of a grand Polish conspiracy to Stalin, and then with Stalin's approval to a plenum of the Central Committee. In March, Yezhov purged the NKVD of Polish officers. Although Belitsky was not Polish but Ukrainian by nationality, he now found himself in a very awkward position. If the Polish military organization had been so important, asked Yezhov, why had Belitsky not been more vigilant? Thus Belitsky, who had summoned up the specter of the Polish military organization in the first place, became a victim of his own creation. He yielded his Ukrainian position in May to his former deputy, Israel Lepelski. the NKVD officer who carried out the Kulak operation in Soviet Ukraine with such vigor. On 7 July, Belitsky was arrested on charges of espionage for Poland. A week later, his name was removed from the stadium where Dynamo Kiev played its soccer matches, to be replaced by Yezhov's. Belitsky was executed that November. Page 92. Snyder's sources, note 8, page 471, Nikolitsky, Reprezhneva, 337, Stronsky, Reprej, 227. For details on Belitsky, see Shapoval Belitsky, 69-74. Snyder is inventing stories again. There's nothing in any of his sources about Ezhov asking Belitsky why he had not been more vigilant, or Belitsky becoming a victim of his own creation. Nolitsky Reprezhneva 337 simply describes the beginning of the Ezhovchina of July 1937 onwards, with quotations from a few of the central NKVD texts. There's nothing about the POW-PMO Ezhov report, Belitsky, Lepelvsky, or any of the matters specifically mentioned in this paragraph. Stronsky, Reprej 227, does discuss Ezhov in the PMO case, but it does not deal with any of the matters in this paragraph, Ezhov's January 1937 report or Belitsky or Lepelvsky. Stronsky does not mention Belitsky after 1936. According to the bibliography in Bloodlands, Shapoval Belitsky is an article in the Ukrainian language collection. The text of the article ends on page 73, so the reference cannot be 69-74. Only pages 69 through 70 give relevant information about Belitsky, but that is interesting. Quote, Belitsky was arrested January 7, 1937 in his official car on the undated warrant number 15 signed by N. Ezhov. They searched him and took away his government awards, 3 orders of the Red Banner, the Order of Red Star, and the Red Banner of Labor of the USSR, 2 awards Honorable Chekist. He did not hold out long, and his statement of July 17th admitted that he was recruited by I. Yaker at the end of 1935 into the military fascist rebellion, and on July 26th, an interrogation conducted by Deputy People's Commissar of Internal Affairs of the USSR, L. Belsky, head of the 5th Division HUDB NKVD of the USSR in Nikolaev Zhurid, and his assistant, R. Listengert, Belitsky testified that he personally recruited his deputies, M. Bachinsky and B. Ivanov, chief of the 6th Division UDB NKVD USSR, IA Pisminy, and heads UNKVD in the Kharkov region, S. Mazau, in Vorozhna region, O. Razanov. End quote, page 69. The dates of these interrogations may or may not be correct. Shapoval gives only an archival identifier that of course cannot be verified. Parenthetically, it would appear inexcusable in this day of the internet for honest researchers to cite archival documents as evidence without either publishing them, perhaps online, or else stating plainly that archival authorities will not allow their publication. A statement summarizing Belitsky's confessions and including all the information Shapoval gives above is printed in Lubyanka 1937-1938, number 144, dated July 21st, 1937. Snyder shows no familiarity with this vital and widely known collection of Soviet primary documents that bear directly upon this subject. Shapoval does not refer to it either. Belitsky's other confessions have not been declassified, but his statements are corroborated in a very long and detailed confession of D.M. Dmitriev, another NKVD head, Sverdlovsk, of October 16, 1938, after Beria had effectively taken over the NKVD from Ezhov. Lubyanka 1937-1938, number 356, page 577 FF. Some of Dmitriev's confession can be verified by comparing it with other evidence we now have. None of Snyder's sources document his statement that Belitsky was arrested on charges of espionage for Poland. It appears that Snyder has invented this or copied it from someone else who invented it first. We now have overwhelming evidence, including evidence from beyond the borders of the USSR, that the conspiracy of Soviet military leaders against the Stalin regime, often called the Tukhachevsky affair, really did take place. Footnote. For example, see Grover Furr, The Murder of Sergei Kirov, Chapter 17, Furr and Vladimir L. Bobrov, Marshal S. M. Boudini on the Tukhachevsky trial, Impressions of an Eyewitness. End of footnote. There has never been any evidence, as opposed to assertions by Soviet and Russian authorities, that this was a frame-up of innocent men. In view of the evidence we now have, it could not have been. Therefore, there is no basis, no evidence, to sustain any doubt that Belitsky really was involved with the Tukhachevsky military conspiracy. Snyder could and should have used these primary sources, instead of the older secondary source by Shapoval. As for Shapoval himself, we cannot accept his unsupported word. As we have showed in Chapter 1 by examining one of his articles, Shapoval cannot be trusted to quote his sources honestly. There is some very interesting and important material about Belitsky in Shapoval's article, and in other documents not cited by Snyder, but which he should have used. But Snyder ignores all these matters, perhaps because he doesn't know about them, perhaps because they do not support his conspiracy theories. Quote, even if the idea of a deep Polish penetration of Soviet institutions persuaded Yezhov and Stalin, it could not serve as the evidentiary basis for individual arrests. There simply was nothing resembling a vast Polish plot in the Soviet Union. Yezhov told Stalin that Polish political émigrés were major suppliers of spies and provocateur elements in the USSR. Leading Polish communists were often already in the Soviet Union, and sometimes already dead. Some 69 of the 100 members of the Central Committee of the Polish Party were executed in the USSR. Most of the rest were behind bars in Poland, and so were unavailable for execution, and in any case, these numbers were far too small. End quote, page 94. Sources, note 13, page 472. On the suppliers, see Kuromaya, Stalin, 118. On the Polish diplomats, see Snyder's sketches 121 to 127. For the data on the Central Committee, see Kaczynski, Reprej, 198. On the experiences of Polish communists in the USSR, Budznitska's Strepsa is invaluable. In contrast to Snyder, Kuromaya, Stalin 118 admits that there may well have been assassination plans against Soviet leaders. Snyder chooses not to inform his readers that Kuromaya, who is extremely hostile to Stalin, considers the idea of conspiracies plausible. In fact, we have a great deal of evidence concerning such plots. Footnote, Budznitska's Strepsa is a book of personal memoirs, not relevant to any of the specific assertions Snyder makes here. End of footnote. As for Jansen and Petrov on the pages cited by Kuromaya, JMP 40 through 41, they also assert that the Polish military organization, POW, POV, PMO, no longer existed, but this is a bluff. As we have explained above, they cannot possibly know whether a secret organization did or did not exist. All they or Snyder can in fact know is that it had been publicly disbanded, but they do not cite any evidence of that either. We have already shown that there is plenty of evidence that the Polish military organization continued to exist as late as 1942. Jansen and Petrov also add, quote, in September 1935, a new wave of arrests started, with a view to end an alleged POV network. During the same month, the representative of the Polish Communist Party in the Comintern Executive Committee, B. Bronkowski, Bortnowski, sent Yezhov a memorandum on deficiencies in the NKVD work concerning the exposure of the agent provocateur and espionage role of Polish agents. In the more recent Russian edition of 2007, this passage is the same, page 54. As head of the NKVD, whose duties included state security, Yezhov would have been a fool not to heed such a warning from one of the leaders of the Polish Communist Party. In note 87, Jansen and Petrov informed their readers that they were not allowed to see the document. They repeated this note in the recent Russian language edition of this book, page 54, but they believe it exists, or they would not have included this information in their book. Snyder's sketches 121 to 127 documents the considerable network of spies that the Polish government did in fact have in the USSR. On pages 125 to 126, Snyder quotes documents indicating that by November 1937, Polish intelligence had very little remaining of its network. Of course, that means that Polish intelligence did have such a network prior to that date. By the evidence, Snyder himself cites that network was active earlier in the decade. No central committee is mentioned by Kaczynski, Reprej 198. Footnote: if there were, why go to a Polish book published in the 1980s to find out about it? There has to be a great deal of detailed information in former communist archives. End of footnote. Snyder falsifies a quotation. In the following paragraph, Snyder makes a dramatic charge. Quote, one Moscow NKVD chief understood the gist of the order. His organization should destroy the Poles entirely. His officers looked for Polish names in the telephone book. End quote. Pages 94 to 95. Snyder's sources are the following. Note 14, page 472. Quotation: Petrov, Polskaya, Opritsaya, 23. The phone book anecdote is in Brown, No Place, 158. This is the passage in Petrov, really Petrov and Roginski, two leading researchers of the Moscow-based Memorial Society. Quote, as A.O. Postel, UNKVD officer in Moscow Oblast, admitted, when we, heads of departments, heard Ezhov's order to arrest absolutely all Poles, the order did not say all Poles, but it was characteristic that it was heard that way, authors, Polish political immigrants, former POWs, members of the Polish Communist Party et al. This caused not just amazement, but a number of unofficial conversations that only ceased when we were told that this order had been approved by Stalin and the Politburo of the CCVKPB, and that it was necessary to smash the Poles completely. End quote. Snyder does not inform us, as Petrov and Roginski do, of the source of this statement. Archive of the UFSB for Moscow and Moscow Oblast investigative file of A.O. Postel number 52668, interrogation of December 11, 1939. Postel was being interrogated in 1939 in the case of the mass murders carried out by Ezhov and his men. We have further evidence of this fact in Seviernov's work. Quote, former chief of the 3rd Division of the 3rd Department of the UNKVD of Moscow Oblast, Lieutenant of State Security A.O. Postel, was sentenced in April 1940 to 15 years deprivation of freedom for serious violation of the law, arrests without foundation, application of physical force, etc. End quote. Postel, that is, was arrested on January 9th, 1939. Shortly after, Beria had replaced Ezhov and investigated for the crimes he had committed as an NKVD man. He was punished with a long sentence. This is further evidence of Beria's and therefore of Stalin's prosecution of Ezhov's men for participating in Ezhov's conspiracy against the Soviet government. Brown, No Place, 158, actually 158 to 159, writes, quote, NKVD agent Stanislav Redins confessed that agents hunted down Polish spies by looking through the Moscow phone book for Polish last names. End quote. Footnote 20. Kate Brown, A Biography of No Place, From Ethnic Borderland to Soviet Heartland, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 2004-2003, end of footnote. Brown's source for this is a 1993 article in a rare Ukrainian journal by Ukrainian nationalist historian Sergei Bilokin. This interrogation of Redins is also reprinted in a book by Leonid Naumov that Snyder cites 3 times in his footnotes, including on the very next page of his book. Why didn't he tell his readers that they can find it there? Evidently, he did not know this because he had not taken the trouble to check the original source. Here is the passage Snyder and Brown refer to. Quote, after my departure to Kazakhstan, Zakhovsky carried out obviously criminal activity in these cases. In 2 months, he arrested 12,500 persons, and arrests were made by consulting a telephone book as long as the names seemed Polish, Latvian, Bulgarian, etc. End quote. Both Snyder and Brown have interpreted this passage incorrectly. Redins testified that he had heard that Zakhovsky's men used the telephone book to look for Polish last names. This happened after he had left for Kazakhstan, so Redens did not know this at first hand. Rather, Redens accused Zhukovsky and his men of doing so after he, Redens, left to become commissar of the Kazakhstan NKVD. This was in January 1938 when Zhukovsky had just been appointed head of the UNKVD in Moscow Oblast. The commissar was, of course, Ezhov. Snyder compounds this error by misreading what Brown wrote. Snyder claims that the officers who used the telephone book were under the command of the NKVD chief, who thought Ezhov said to destroy the Poles entirely. The NKVD man who understood Ezhov's order in this way, Petrov and Rosinski add that Ezhov did not actually say this, was Postel, not Zhukovsky. Zhukovsky was the NKVD chief, not Postel. Redens made this statement under arrest while he was being investigated for helping Ezhov in mass murder. Redens was arrested on November 22, 1938, virtually as soon as Beria took Ezhov's place as the head of the NKVD. According to Belokin, Redens made this specific statement in a confession of April 14, 1939. He was tried, convicted, and executed in January 1940, at the same time as many other top Ezhov NKVD leaders. Snyder omits all the facts above and the entire context in which these statements were made. The result is that Snyder gives the impression that these tactics were Soviet and therefore Stalin's policies. In fact, the opposite was the case. These men were arrested and being investigated for flagrant violations of Soviet law by Ezhov and his cronies. The context, which Snyder completely omits, is crucial, as it is part of the vast amounts of evidence we now have that Ezhov carried out these national operations independently without the knowledge of the Stalin government and in an attempt to further its overthrow. Snyder claims that Stalin hated all Poles. Snyder claims that Stalin made a racist, anti-Polish statement. Quote, Ezhov reported to Stalin that 23,216 arrests had already been made in the Polish operation. Stalin expressed his delight. Very good. Keep on digging up and cleaning out this Polish filth. Eliminate it in the interests of the Soviet Union. End quote, page 96. Sources, note 17, page 472. Quotation and number, Naumov, NKVD, 299-300. For examples, see Stronsky, Reprej, 223-246. Snyder's statement is false. According to Naumov, Snyder's own source, Stalin wrote, Polish spy filth, or the filth of Polish spies. This sounds wrong in English, but is correct in Russian. That is, the filth were spies, who happened in this case to be Polish. The Stalin quotation is indeed in Naumov. Footnote, in my edition of Naumov's book, this quotation is on page 209 and 210. End of footnote. The original source, a note by Stalin on a report sent to him by Ezhov dated September 14, 1937, is at the foot of page 359 of the important document collection we have noted before, Lubyanka 1937 to 1938. Here is Stalin's remark on Ezhov's report. Translated. Comrade Ezhov, very good. Dig up and clean out in the future, too, this Polish spy filth. Smash it in the interests of the USSR. I, Stalin, 14-9-37. To be able to discern Snyder's falsehood, you have to read Russian and to know where to look. Snyder's readers will believe falsely that Stalin called Poles filth, as Snyder intends they should. Snyder tries to make it seem as though Stalin hated all Poles. Later on the same page, 96, Snyder says, quote, people such as the Juritsky's, who had nothing to do with Polish espionage of any kind, were the filth to which Stalin was referring. He also repeated the same falsehood in one of his essays. Stalin spoke of Polish filth, 2010. Evidently, Snyder thinks that none of his readers will bother to check the dramatic allegation that Stalin made such a racist statement. Snyder uses this phony quotation in his standard talk on his book as well. Later, in this same chapter, Snyder repeats the accusation that Stalin hated Poles and deliberately set out to murder them. Although Stalin, Yezhov, Belitsky, Lepelski, Berman, and others linked Polish ethnicity to Soviet security, page 104, This is yet another falsehood. Snyder has no evidence that Stalin ever did anything of the kind. No such evidence exists. Quote, but perhaps, Stalin reasoned, killing Poles could do no harm. End quote. The breathtaking dishonesty of such a statement hardly needs to be pointed out. Stalin never supported killing Poles, and of course Snyder has no evidence that he did. Stronsky Reprej recounts some sentences of terms in a camp or to death, the latter of some persons whose bodies were found by the Germans in the Vinitsa in 1943, where they organized another mass exhumation for propaganda purposes and wrote a report along lines identical to their Katyn report. Stronsky's point here is simply that some of these victims had Polish-sounding names. Those responsible for the mass murders of the Azov period, including of Poles, were arrested, tried, and convicted, and in many cases executed, for these immense crimes. Snyder falsifies yet another citation. On the next page, this whole chapter concerns the period 1937 to 1938, Snyder writes the following, quote, Leningraders and Poles had little idea of these proportions at the time. There was only the fear of the knock on the door in the early morning and the sight of the prison truck called the Black Maria or the Soul Destroyer, or by the Poles the Black Raven, and never more. As one Pole remembered, people went to bed each night not knowing whether they would be awakened by the sun or by the Black Raven. End quote. Pages 97 to 98. His source, note 21, page 472, is Awakened. Dzwonski. Glod, 236, Black Raven appears in Polish and Russian, Black Maria in Russian. Snyder cites no evidence at all to support his claim about the fear of Leningraders. He has only one anecdotal story about the fear of Poles, and this is about a period a few years earlier, the Dzwonkowski passage. Footnote. In Dzwonkowski Glod, 236, the passage about the Black Raven concerns 1933 and 1934 during the famine, while Snyder's text concerns the Polish operation of 1937 to 1938. End of footnote. Without evidence to support his claim about the fear of Leningraders and Poles, it is misleading and dishonest for Snyder to insert these claims into his book. Was the Belarusian intelligentsia the special target of the NKVD? Snyder makes the following dramatic accusation. Quote, the mass killing in Soviet Belarus included the deliberate destruction of the educated representatives of Belarusian national culture. End quote. Snyder gives the following details. Quote, as one of Berman's colleagues later put it, he destroyed the flower of the Belarusian intelligentsia. No fewer than 218 of the country's leading writers were killed. Berman told his subordinates that their careers depended upon their rapid fulfillment of Order 00485. The speed and quality of the work in discovering and arresting Polish spies will be the main consideration taken into account in the evaluation of each leader. Page 98, end quote. Source, note 23, page 472. On the National Purge, see Naumov, NKVD, 262 to 266, Flower quotation at 266, Berman quotation, Michniuk, Prejwick, Polikow, 115. This should be Polikom, Grover Furr. On the 218 writers, see Mirionowitz, Belarus, 88 to 89, see also Junga, Vertical, 624. As is almost always the case, a check of Snyder's sources reveals quite a different story. Junga Vertical 624 is a only very short list of the NKVD troikas in Belarusia of 1937 to 1938. It adds nothing to any understanding of what happened. It appears that Snyder added it to pad his footnote, make it look more thoroughly researched. Meanwhile, as we demonstrate, Snyder omitted crucial informations that his sources do supply. Mironowitz, Belarus, 88 to 89, I had access to the 2004 Belarusian and 2007 Polish editions. Footnote. As a republic of the Soviet Union, the country, now called Belarus after its name in its official language, Belarusian, was usually called Belarusia or the Belarusian SSR. Between 1921 and 1939, Belarusia was divided between the USSR and Poland. End of footnote. The figure of 218 writers killed is in both of them. Polish 2007 edition on page 94 of 238 Belarusian literary figures of the Stalin period, only some 20 survived. But no evidence or source for this information is cited, nor is the Stalin period defined. but Mironowitz certainly means the period of the Azovchina, 1937 to 1938, when Azov was killing as many Soviet citizens as he could in order to sow discontent with the USSR among the population and facilitate an uprising to coincide with an invasion by one or more imperialist countries. Footnote, see Furr, the Moscow Trials and the Great Terror for evidence for this statement. End of footnote. As we shall see, Belarusian historian Shebeka, Polish spelling Sibieka, whom Snyder cites elsewhere, claimed that the anti-communist Polish AK, Armia Krajowa Home Army, killed thousands of Belarusian teachers and intellectuals, a fact Snyder omits. In my 2010 edition of Naumov NKVD, the national operation is covered not on pages 262 to 266, but on page 207 and following. The flower of the Belarusian intelligentsia quotation is indeed in Naumov. Its origin is a quotation from the book by famed Soviet spy D.A. Bystroletov, sometimes spelled Bystrolyotov, The Feast of the Immortals. This is a quotation at third hand. Bystrolyotov claimed that these were the words of A.A. Naistkin, Boris Berman's successor as NKVD chief of Belarusia. Listen. In Minsk, during less than 1 year of work, Boris shot more than 80,000 people. Do you understand me? I understand you. He killed all the best communists in the Belarusian Republic. He decapitated the Soviet apparatus. He destroyed the flower of the national Belarusian intelligentsia. He carefully sought out, found, pulled up, and destroyed every one of the working people who stood out in terms of intelligence or dedication. Stakhanovite workers in factories, chairmen of collective farms, the best team leaders, writers, scholars, and artists, the national cadres of Soviet workers who had been trained by the party. 80,000 innocent victims, a sky-high mountain of blood-soaked corpses. Third-hand quotations, Naitskins to Bilistriolov, to us, over a period of many years, are notoriously subject to distortion or even invention. However, we should note that what Snyder does not mention in this quotation, Natskin allegedly told Bystroletov that Berman had killed the best communists in Belarusia, government officials, the Soviet apparatus, the flower of the national Belarusian intelligentsia, Stakhanovite workers, chairmen of collective farms, team leaders, writers, scholars, and artists. But Snyder mentions only the Belarusian intelligentsia. This implies that they were Berman's special target. But Bystrolyotov mentions them third of 7 or 8 groups of people that he says were targeted by Berman. Moreover, by omitting the essential context of this statement, Snyder leaves the impression that this mass murder was not just Berman's and Azov's aim, but also that of Stalin and the Soviet government. In reality, it was just the opposite. Azov, Berman, Naiskin, and others were being prosecuted and were to be executed for their mass murders. Berman was arrested in September 1938. At this time, Azov was still the head People's Commissar of the NKVD, but Lavrentiy Beria had been appointed as his deputy in August 1938, unquestionably to oversee Azov's activities, which had finally aroused the suspicions of Stalin and the Soviet leadership. Berman's arrest must reflect Beria's involvement. Of equal interest is this: a study of the pages from Naumov's book that Snyder cites, 262 to 266, reveals some important information that Snyder withheld from his readers. For example, interestingly, in January 1939, S. Miryanov Korol was arrested and almost immediately testified that in July 1937, in a private conversation, Vernovsky told him of Azov's intention to come to power on the basis of their group in the NKVD. Of course, one might attribute this to the imagination of Beria's investigators, but here's an interesting detail. Miryanov's wife, Agnes Miryanov, in her memoirs, says almost the same thing. We thought that Azov had risen even higher than Stalin. These thoughts, according to the text of memoirs, are from some time in mid-1938. But who is this we who were thinking such thoughts? Judging by the text of Miryanova's memoirs, she was then talking only with the members of her family, with Miryanov's brother, the intelligence official, David Korol, and his family, and with the Vernovsky family. We have a great deal of other documentary evidence that Azov led a conspiracy of his own that was linked to other right conspiracies, including that of Bukharin and Rykov and that of Tukhachevsky. For example, we have confessions by Furnovsky, Azov himself, and others, which I have made available online in Russian and in English translations. Once again, Snyder has deliberately deceived his readers. This passage from Naumov's book, which Snyder cites several times, is the proof that he knows about it. Jansen and Petrov also discuss Azov's conspiracy. The more recent Russian-language edition of their book, Petrov and Jansen, the authors' names are reversed for the Russian edition, discusses it in even more detail. But Snyder fails to tell his readers about it. No doubt this is because it reveals that Stalin and the Soviet state had not ordered the Azov mass murders. Michniak, Przyzwokow Polkom, 115 does record the statement quoted by Snyder, quote, "Once again I warn you that the pace and quality of work on the detection and arrest of Polish spies will first of all be taken into account when evaluating the work of each director." Berman, 22nd October 1937, end quote. In order to evaluate this statement, we need to know more about Berman. Snyder has failed to inform us that Berman was part of Azov's conspiracy against Stalin and the Soviet government. On August 4th, 1939, Azov gave a lengthy and very important confession about his anti-Soviet conspiracy, during which he mentioned Berman's role in the national campaign. This confession is printed for the first time in Petrov and Jansen. In it, Azov describes his plan, which included massive illegal repressions so as to sow dissent among the Soviet population and facilitate an anti-Soviet uprising. Question: are you aware of the facts concerning how the dissatisfaction of the population was concretely expressed? Answer: from what Uspensky said, I know that flights through the border posts into Poland increased as a result of the provocational conduct of the mass operations, especially in the border regions of the Ukraine. The families of those repressed began to be expelled from kolkhozes, and, in connection with that, robberies, arson, and thefts began. There were even a few examples of terrorist acts against workers of the village Soviets and kolkhozes. Not only families of the repressed, but rank-and-file kolkhoz members and even party members began to write complaints. Dissatisfaction with the punitive policy was so great that local party organizations began to insist that all family members of persons who had been repressed be resettled from the Ukraine to other regions. Such, in general terms, were the result of the provocational conduct of the mass operations in the Ukraine. We were successful in achieving about the same results in Belarusia, too. At the time the mass operations were taking place, B. Berman was in charge of the NKVD of Belarusia. Question: was Berman a member of the conspiratorial organization in the NKVD? Answer: Berman was not a member of our conspiratorial organization. However, Furnovsky, Belsky, and I knew by the beginning of 1938 that he was an active member of Yagoda's anti-Soviet conspiratorial group. We did not plan to draw Berman into our conspiratorial organization. Already at that time he was sufficiently compromised and was subject to arrest. However, we delayed his arrest. In turn, Berman, who feared arrest, worked very hard. I only had to give him general directives that Belarusia was badly infested and that it was necessary to purge it in a thoroughgoing way, and he carried out the mass operations with the same result as Uspensky. Question: with what result specifically? Answer: he incessantly demanded an increase of limits and, following Uspensky's example, put nationalists into the category of persons subject to repression, carried out completely unfounded arrests, created exactly the same kind of dissatisfaction in the border regions of Belarusia, and left the families of those repressed where they were. There were even more warnings sent to the NKVD and the procuracy concerning dissatisfaction among the population of the border regions of Belarusia than in the Ukraine. We left all these too without investigating them and hid them from the Central Committee of the party and the government. Footnote: Nikita Petrov, Mark Jansen, Nikolai Azov, Moscow, Raspin, 2008, pages 367 to 379. End of footnote. 2 days earlier, on August 2nd, 1939, Azov had testified as follows concerning Berman, quote, "In Belarusia, you sent Boris Berman. Did you know that he was an old German agent? Yes. Artnow told me that Berman was working for German intelligence as soon as I became Commissar of Internal Affairs. He had been recruited at the beginning of the 30s, when he was a Soviet resident in Germany. I immediately established espionage contact with him. Then he was the assistant chief of the INO Foreign Department. In 1937, I especially sent him from our organization to Belarusia, and made him Commissar of Internal Affairs. There, he met with German agents and received assignments and instructions. That means your widespread espionage organization in the case of an attack on the USSR by Japan and Germany could seize power not only in Moscow, but in border areas, opening the road to the invaders. Do I understand this correctly from your confessions? Yes, that's exactly what we had planned. It's useless to deny such things. End quote. Berman was tried, convicted, and executed in February 1939 after Beria had replaced Ezhov. According to Ezhov, Berman was really a Iagoda man. A. Naistkin, on the other hand, was one of Ezhov's men, tried and sentenced to death in January 1940 with many other of Ezhov's closest NKVD collaborators. Ezhov himself was tried and executed in early February 1940. As one of Ezhov's chief henchmen, it is hard to imagine Naistkin claiming somebody else was bloody. It would be the pot calling the kettle black. Snyder has omitted all the evidence long available that Berman, along with Ezhov, were conspiring against Stalin and the Soviet government. The effect is to create the false impression that Berman and Ezhov were carrying out the orders of the Soviet government. This is in fact what Snyder states. Once again, Snyder has deceived his readers. There is no hint of all these important details in Snyder's account, and that account is false to boot. Either Snyder knows virtually nothing about the Ezhovchina, i.e., he has not studied the scholarship on it, or he does know something about it, but has concealed it from his readers in order to give his book a suitably anti-Stalin and anti-Soviet bias. According to Jansen and Petrov, quote, Aletsky Naitskin, the former Smolensk NKVD chief, and from May 1938 on Interior People's Commissar of Belarusia, described the situation at the conference in this way. Footnote, Jansen and Petrov mean People's Commissar of Internal Affairs, end of footnote. Ezhov approved of the activity of those NKVD chiefs, who cited astronomic numbers of persons repressed, such as, for instance, the NKVD chief of Western Siberia, citing a number of 55,000 people arrested, Dmitriev of Sverdlovsk province, 40,000, Berman of Belarusia, 60,000, Upensky of Orenburg, 40,000, Lushkov of the Far East, 70,000, Redins of Moscow province, 50,000. The Ukrainian NKVD chiefs each cited numbers of people arrested from 30,000 to 40,000. Having listened to the numbers, Ezhov, in his concluding remarks, praised those who had excelled and announced that undoubtedly excesses had taken place here and there, such as, for instance, in the Kubayshev, where, Postaishev's instructions, Zurvalev had transplanted all active party members of the province. But he immediately added that in such a large-scale operation, mistakes are inevitable. End quote. JNP, page 131. Same quotation in Russian, P and J, 146. Naitskin made this statement on July 16, 1939, under arrest and during the investigation of his case by Beria's men. Having regained control of the NKVD from Ezhov, Stalin and his forces were investigating the enormous atrocities committed by Ezhov and his men and punishing the guilty parties. It is this that the ideological anti-communists like Snyder wish to conceal from their readers. Snyder claims that Japan did not move against the USSR after mid-1937. Quote, the Japanese leadership had decided upon a southern strategy toward China and then the Pacific. Japan intervened in China in July 1937, right when the Great Terror began, and would move further southward only thereafter. End quote. It is hard to imagine how anyone could make such an ignorant statement and think it would not be noticed. In reality, Japan attacked the USSR twice after 1937, in the Lake Khasan or Chongku-Feng incident of July through August 1938. The Red Army lost about 236 killed. The Japanese Army perhaps twice that number. But from May to mid-September 1939, a real war was fought between the USSR and Japan. This was the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, or Nomonhan Incident. The Soviet Union and Japan each lost about 8,000 soldiers. It played an important part in Soviet negotiations with the UK and France, since the USSR was determined not to fight two wars at the same time, one in Europe against Germany, and the second in Asia against Japan. The Soviet victory at Khalkhin Gol convinced the Japanese not to attack the USSR. Snyder has to know about this. Evidently, he thinks his readers are so ignorant that they would accept his statement here at face value. Snyder invents Stalin's theory of interrogation. Quote, Stalin had brought to life his theory that the enemy could be unmasked only by interrogation. End quote, page 107. Where did this theory come from? Snyder has no documentation for this statement, not even false documentation. There is no evidence that Stalin had any such theory. This is yet another falsehood. Snyder reads Stalin's mood. It is evidently important to Snyder's project that Stalin be personally responsible for the mass murders of the Azovchina. The problem is that all the evidence now available points in the opposite direction. Presumably this is why Snyder, like other ideologically motivated writers, repeatedly invents his facts. For example, Snyder claims that Stalin was made happier, or something like that, by all the mass murders. Quote, Yet the conversion of columns of peasants and workers into columns of figures seemed to lift Stalin's mood. End quote, page 107. Snyder has fabricated this weird factoid. How can Snyder know Stalin's mood anyway? Its purpose, evidently, is to portray Stalin as some kind of bloodthirsty monster. Once again, there is no evidence to support it. Historians have no business engaging in this cheap psychologizing propaganda disguised as history. The Azovchina as Stalin's policy. At this point in Chapter 4, Snyder inserts the quotation with which we open our discussion of the Azovchina. See the following chapter, quote, And the course of the Great Tear certainly confirmed Stalin's position of power. Having called a halt to the mass operations in November 1938, Stalin once again replaced his NKVD chief. Lavrentiy Beria succeeded Yezhov, who was later executed. The same fate awaited many of the highest officers of the NKVD, blamed for the supposed excesses, which were in fact the substance of Stalin's policy. End quote, pages 107 to 108. For ideologically anti-communist researchers, it is important that these mass murders be Stalin's plan and intention, but this is false. When Stalin acted, he did so on the basis of reports sent to him through Ezhov. According to V.N. Kaustov, a very anti-Stalin research, and one of the compilers of several of these invaluable document collections, these reports were falsified. Quote, And the most frightening thing was that Stalin made his decisions on the basis of confessions that were the results of the inventions of certain employees of the organs of state security. Stalin's reactions attest to the fact that he took these confessions completely seriously. End quote. Snyder. Stalin didn't lose, therefore he was always in control. Snyder then says, quote, Because Stalin had been able to replace Yagoda with Ezhov, and then Yezhov with Beria, he showed himself to be at the top of the security apparatus. Because he was able to use the NKVD against the party, but also the party against the NKVD, he showed himself to be the unchallengeable leader of the Soviet Union. Soviet socialism had become a tyranny, where the tyrant's power was demonstrated by the mastery of the politics of his own court. End quote. Page 107 to 108. Source, note 43, page 474, Kvelnyuk, Party and NKVD 2328, Benner, Massen Mord, 591 to 593. The false logic in this paragraph of Snyder's is worth examining also because it is used by other anti-communist researchers as well. Snyder commits the logical fallacy of post hoc ergo propter hoc. Because Yagoda and then Ezhov both conspired to overthrow Stalin, but both failed, Snyder concludes that Stalin was always in control. Imagine applying this to football games. The team that won was always going to win, and the fact that they won proved that they were in control of the outcome the whole time. Logic like this is evidently intended to absolve anti-communist researchers of the normal scholarly trouble of having to find evidence to support their assumptions. These are puzzling statements that require examination. Of course, it has to be true that Stalin ended up at the top of the security apparatus after Ezhov's removal, but this does not address the main question here, which is, did Ezhov violate the Politburo's, Stalin's, orders in pursuing these mass executions of innocent persons or not? And when did Stalin use the party against the NKVD? Evidently, Snyder is trying to imply that Stalin planned everything that Ezhov did because Stalin had succeeded in removing Ezhov. Of course, the latter does not imply the former at all. If Stalin did not know about Azov's criminal mass murders and then found out about them, he would have wanted to remove him. From the evidence we have, this appears to be what happened. Once again, Snyder appears to be trying to insinuate something that he cannot prove. Naturally, Stalin did not have any court, nor was he a tyrant, whatever that means, or a dictator, one whose word is law. Stalin had been openly challenged at the June 1937 Central Committee plenum and was to be decisively defeated in October 1937 in his desire to have competitive elections to the Soviets as stipulated by the new Constitution. Footnote, see Grover Furr, Stalin and the Struggle for Democratic Reform, Part 1, Cultural Logic, 2005, paragraphs 112 ff, and the sources cited therein. End of footnote. Turning for clarification to the sources Snyder cites here, we find that Khmelnyuk, Party in NKVD 2328, contains no evidence to support any of the claims in this paragraph. It merely summarizes in very general terms the situation after Azov's resignation in late 1938. Benner, Massenmord, actually Benner and Junge, entitled Wie der Terror groß wurde, Massenmord under Lagerhaft nach Beifall, 00447, also summarizes the events of September to November 1938. While insinuating their conviction that Stalin was in control of what Azov was doing, this assumption is common to all anti-communist researchers, neither Benner nor Junge nor any of the other anti-communist researchers have any evidence to support their conviction. This is pure ideology, common to most, if not all, anti-communist writers. They want evidence that Stalin was in charge of Azov's mass murders. Unfortunately, all the evidence points in the opposite direction, so they just assert that Stalin was really in charge. Benner and Junge do note that as early as 1993, Boris Starkov claimed that Azov had not informed Stalin of his actions. Although Benner and Junge disagree with this statement of Starkov's, they have no evidence to support their disagreement. It should not surprise us that Snyder fails to mention this, but we now know that Starkov was correct. In fact, he did not go nearly far enough. We now have the evidence that Azov's mass murders were not authorized at all and were part of Azov's conspiracy to overthrow the government and party leadership. Footnote. Starkov's statement is in his essay, Narkom Azov, in J. Arch Getty and Roberta T. Manning, editors, Stalinist Terror, New Perspectives, Cambridge University Press, 1993, page 38, end of footnote. Snyder, noting a person's nationality is not so very different from Nazism. Quote, Germany's Nuremberg laws of 1935 excluded Jews from political participation in the German state and had defined Jewishness according to descent. German officials were indeed using the records of synagogues to establish whose grandparents were Jews. Yet in the Soviet Union, the situation was not so very different. The Soviet internal passports had a national category, so that every Soviet Jew, every Soviet Pole, and indeed every Soviet citizen had an officially recorded nationality. In principle, Soviet citizens were allowed to choose their own nationality, but in practice this was not always so. In April 1938, the NKVD required that in certain cases information about the nationality of parents be entered. By the same order, Poles and other members of diaspora nationalities were expressly forbidden from changing their nationality. End quote. Page 110, note, Hirsch, Empire, 293 to 294. This is another dishonest attempt by Snyder to bracket Soviet policy with Nazi racism. Snyder has certainly not read the NKVD requirement he refers to. He does not even give a date for it. His source, Francine Hirsch, footnote, Empire of Nations, Ethnographic Knowledge and the Making of the Soviet Union, Cornell University Press, 2005, pages 293 to 294, end of footnote, discusses the fact that both the cancelled 1937 census and the subsequent 1938 census permitted all citizens to declare their national identities according to their conscience and not their birth. Hirsch then cites, though without quoting it, an archival document according to which in April 1938 the NKVD began to require new passports to record the nationality of the holder's parents. In later pages, Hirsch goes on to discuss the struggle between census officials who wanted to retain self-designation of nationality and the NKVD, which was concerned about the possible loyalty conflicts of persons with foreign roots. Hirsch explicitly disagrees with two other anti-communist researchers, Tony Martin and Eric Weitz, who she believes greatly exaggerate the significance of this NKVD directive. Hirsch completely rejects any comparison of Soviet and German Nazi policies on nationality because, in fact, they were very different. In a very multinational state such as the USSR, nationality was an important component of individual identity. It had nothing to do with Nazi notions of genetic superiority and inferiority. However, there are some problems with Hirsch's analysis. For one thing, Hirsch interprets the new NKVD policy as indicative of Soviet policy, as she does terror. She appears ignorant of the fact that in 1937 to 1938, the NKVD under Nikolai Ezhov was out of control. We have taken the trouble to obtain the text of this document. It has never been reprinted since its first appearance in an obscure Memorial Society newsletter. Now that we have the text of the NKVD directive of April 1938, we can discern a more serious problem with Hirsch's discussion. She misrepresents what the NKVD directive actually says. She states, quote, "The explicit aim of the NKVD passport decree of April 1938 was to ferret out members of suspect nations who, the NKVD claimed, were concealing their true identities." 275. The NKVD introduced this decree in April 1938, directing registrars to write the nationality of a passport recipient's parents and not the self-defined nationality of the passport recipient in newly issued passports. If a person's parents belonged to two different nationalities and one belonged to a foreign state, the registrar was to write the nationality of both parents in the passport. Even Poles and Germans who had lived in Russia for generations were designated as people who belonged to a foreign state. 294, end quote. Hirsch cites archival documents, so we cannot be certain that she is referring to the April 1938 NKVD passport decree we quote below, but this document is the only one now available. It contains nothing about suspect nations and does not mention foreign states at all. Hirsch spreads false information about this NKVD regulation, making it appear much more sinister than its text actually warrants. This is possible only because the document is so hard to locate. Petrov and Rogzinski, both of the Memorial Society, refer to it, and certainly read it, since it is published in a Memorial Society publication. Hirsch must have read it too, but her description of it varies widely from the text we have. Snyder fails to inform his readers that the NKVD order is discussed and quoted in part in Petrov and Rogzinski. Polskaya Operacaya NKVD 1937 to 1938 GG. Snyder is certainly aware of this fact, as he repeatedly cites this work. Petrov and Rogzinski mention two different NKVD documents of two different dates, Circular number 65 of April 2nd, 1938, and Explanatory Directive of the Department of Citizenship of the NKVD of the USSR, number 1486178 of April 29, 1938. Footnote 18 in Petrov-Rogzinski states that the second of these documents was published in the very rare journal Memorial Aspect in 1994. They give no source at all for the first document. Here is the text of this document from the rare Memorial Aspect journal, no longer published. Quote, Bureau of Regulations, Civil Status, April 29, 1938, number 1486178. To all chiefs of the OAGS, footnote, Division of Documents of Civil Status, end of footnote, of the NKVD and UNKVD, Circular NKVD number 65 of April 2nd, 1938, has established a new procedure for indicating nationality at the time of the issuance or exchange of passports, requiring that the nationality of the passport holder be based solely on birth nationality by birth of the parents. In this regard, the situation which has existed up to now when nationality of citizens in registering civil documents is regarded as that reported by the registrant is changing. In all cases of documentation, that nationality should be indicated on the basis of the passports presented at registration. Where no passport is present, the determination of the nationality of the registrant is to be done by questioning the individual present. Bear in mind that the notation of nationality must be carried out in conformity with actual national origin of the registrant's Parent, if the parents were German, Poles, etc., regardless of their place of birth, length of time they have resided in the USSR, or change of citizenship, etc., the registrant must not be recorded as a Russian, a Belarusian, etc., when the indicated nationality does not correspond to the registrant's native language or surname. For example, a registrant's surname is Papandopoulou, Muller, but the registrant calls himself Russian, Belarusian, etc., and if at the time of recording it is not possible to establish the actual nationality of the registrant, do not fill out the section on nationality until the individual has presented documentary proof that the registrant belongs to one or another nationality. Explain to the employees of the ZAGS that failure to present documents about nationality can influence only the recording of nationality, but may not delay the registration in general, which is guided in such cases by directives of Chapter 3.22 of the Instruction on Recording Documents. Record the nationality of a baby at birth, if the parents are of different nationalities according to the parents' wishes. In such cases, indicate in the section special remarks that the baby's nationality has been recorded on the basis of the agreement of the parents, i.e., according to the nationality of the father or the mother. If they do not agree, the matter should be decided by the organs of guardianship according to Article 39 of the Code of Laws of the RSFSR and corresponding articles of the Codes of the Union Republics. Do not fill in the nationality until a decision has been reached. Chief of the Bureau of Regulations of Civil Status, Major of State Security, Alivsky. End quote. A study of this document yields some important results. Although they do not admit as much, evidently even Petrov and Rosinski have not seen NKVD USSR Circular No. 65 of April 2, 1938. It is simply referred to at the beginning of the document above. The examples cited in the document make it clear that the aim of the new requirement to determine a citizen's nationality on the basis of his parents' nationality or statement is to avoid absurdities. The examples given are of persons surnamed Papandopoulou and Mueller who claim they are Russian by nationality. In such cases, the directive requires officials to request documentary proof of nationality. It does not give officials the right to determine this themselves. In the USSR, nationality was an important marker of citizenship. Persons of certain nationalities had certain privileges in certain areas of the USSR where that nationality comprised a substantial part of the population. In Soviet institutions, an attempt was made to have affirmative action, a proportion of citizens of minority nationalities that approximated their percentage of the Soviet population. Failure to do this would run the danger of the domination of all important posts by Russians, Ukrainians, or Jews, who usually did predominate unless affirmative steps were taken to promote persons of minority nationalities. It is outrageous for Snyder to suggest that official registration of a citizen's nationality was not so very different from the Nazi practice of racial stigmatization, removal of civil and legal rights, repression, persecution, imprisonment, and murder. Snyder's doing so demonstrates how desperately he strives to bracket Soviet actions with Nazism, whatever the cost to the truth. Snyder sums up his treatment of the Azovchina as follows, quote, "The Soviet Union benefited from the public violence in Nazi Germany. In this atmosphere, supporters of the Popular Front counted on the Soviet Union to protect Europe from the descent into ethnic violence, yet the Soviet Union had just engaged in a campaign of ethnic murder on a far larger scale. It is probably fair to say that no one beyond the Soviet Union had any notion of this. A week after Kristallnacht, the Great Terror was brought to an end after some 247,157 Soviet citizens had been shot in the national operations. As of the end of 1938, the USSR had killed about 1,000 times more people on ethnic grounds than had Nazi Germany. The Soviets had, for that matter, killed far more Jews to that point than had the Nazis. The Jews were targeted in no national action, but they still died in the thousands in the Great Terror, and for that matter, during the famine in Soviet Ukraine. They died not because they were Jews, but simply because they were citizens of the most murderous regime of the day." End quote. Page 111. This is an important paragraph, in that it combines one truthful fact, the number of people killed in the Azovchina, with a fallacious interpretation of that fact. The phrases "the Soviet Union had just engaged," "the USSR had killed," "the Soviets had killed," and "the most murderous regime" are falsifications. in that they express the assumption that these killings were the policy of the Soviet government and the Politburo headed by Stalin. It is a substitute for understanding what was going on. The 1932-1933 famine was not deliberate, so the USSR didn't kill anybody in it, nor did the regime kill people on a national basis. It was Azov who did this in pursuit of his own conspiracy to overthrow the Soviet government. In the official sense, the Soviet government, the Politburo, Stalin, all bore responsibility for Azov's mass murders in that they were formally in overall charge of the country, and therefore were obliged to take steps to stop criminal activity and to punish those responsible. This is true of all governments and heads of state anywhere at any time. However, no one holds a government morally responsible for illegal crimes and atrocities committed by government officials unless the government discovers these crimes and yet refuses to punish the perpetrators. The Stalin government did vigorously pursue, investigate, prosecute, and punish Azov and the NKVD men under him, who were responsible for these atrocities. Therefore, it is not true that the Soviet government or regime was guilty of these mass murders, or that Azov was some kind of scapegoat. Azov's mass murders were a rebellion against the Soviet government, the party, and Stalin. Snyder admits that Poland was anti-Semitic, like Nazi Germany. Quote, grand deportation schemes made a kind of sense in 1938, when leading Nazis could still delude themselves that Poland might become a German satellite, and join in an invasion of the Soviet Union. More than 3 million Jews lived in Poland, and Polish authorities had also investigated Madagascar as a site for their resettlement. Although Polish leaders envisioned no policies toward their large national minorities, 5 million Ukrainians, 3 million Jews, 1 million Belarusians, that were remotely comparable to Soviet realities or Nazi plans, they did wish to reduce the size of the Jewish population by voluntary immigration. After the death of the Polish dictator Joseph Pilsudski in 1935, his successors had taken on the position of the Polish nationalist right on this particular question, and had established a ruling party that was open only to ethnic Poles. End quote, page 112. Here, Snyder finally admits the truth. It was pre-war Poland that was racist, like Nazi Germany. The USSR was not in the least. Snyder denies Poland wanted to invade the USSR alongside Germany. Quote, Pilsudski's heirs in this respect followed Pilsudski's line, a policy of equal distance between Berlin and Moscow with non-aggression pacts with both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, but no alliance with either. On the 26th of January 1939 in Warsaw, the Poles turned down the German foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, one last time, end quote, page 113. In one of his articles, Snyder makes the same false claim, quote, Ribbentrop's master, Adolf Hitler, wanted a deal so that he could begin a war. For the Nazis, the Soviet Union was the main enemy, and its agriculture and oil the prize. But between Germany and the USSR lay Poland, and the Poles expressed no interest in being the junior partner in the adventure. End quote. 2009-4. This is all false. Up till the beginning of 1939, when Hitler decided to turn against Poland before making war on the USSR, the Polish government was maneuvering to join Nazi Germany in a war on the USSR in order to seize more territory. Here is what really happened on January 26, 1939, the date Snyder mentions. Polish Foreign Minister Joseph Beck was in negotiations with Nazi Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop in Warsaw. Ribbentrop wrote, quote, I then spoke to M. Beck once more about the policy to be pursued by Poland and Germany towards the Soviet Union, and in this connection also spoke about the question of the Greater Ukraine, and again proposed Polish-German collaboration in this field. M. Beck made no secret of the fact that Poland had aspirations directed toward the Soviet Ukraine and a connection with the Black Sea. End quote. Footnote 41. English translation in Documents on German Foreign Policy, 1918 to 1945, Series D, Volume 5, The document in question is number 126, pages 167 to 168. This quotation on page 168. End of footnote. Beck told Ribbentrop that Poland would like to seize much of the Ukraine from the USSR, for that was the only way Poland could have had a connection with the Black Sea. Such aspirations could not have been fulfilled without an invasion of the Ukraine. Poland could never have undertaken such an invasion by itself. Therefore, Beck was stating his openness to a joint Polish-German invasion of the Ukraine if the conditions became favorable. This means that, far from expressing no interest in being the junior partner with the Nazis in carving up the USSR, Beck expressed considerable interest, but given the current political situation, begged off. Snyder withholds this information from his readers. Snyder terms Stalin's anti-Hitler move a pro-Hitler move. Quote, in spring 1939, Stalin made a striking gesture toward Hitler, the great ideological foe. Hitler had pledged not to make peace with Jewish communists. Nazi propaganda referred to the Soviet Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Maxim Litvinov, as Finkelstein. Litvinov was indeed Jewish. His brother was a rabbi. Stalin obliged Hitler by firing Litvinov on the 3rd of May 1939. Litvinov was replaced by Stalin's closest ally, Molotov, who was Russian. The indulgence of Hitler. End quote. Page 115. Source, note 56, page 474. Haslam, Collective Security, page 90, page 153. On Litvinov, see Herf, Jewish Enemy, page 104, and Orwell and Politics, page 78. This is completely wrong. Let's look at Snyder's sources. Haslam, Collective Security, page 90. Concerns Litvinov's gloomy conclusions in late 1938 that France was drifting in an anti-Soviet direction. Jacob Sirtis was sent to activate contacts in Berlin, since the last thing the USSR wanted was any kind of Franco-German alliance against the Soviet Union. Sirtis, by the way, was Jewish. At page 163, Haslam outlines similar remarks by Litvinov to the effect that if France would not ally or have anything to do with the USSR, then the Soviets would have to turn towards Germany. Snyder's reference on Litvinov, see Herf, Jewish Enemy 104, is pure bluff. Page 104 of Herf's book discusses how satisfied Goebbels was to see Litvinov back in a prominent position after the Nazi invasion. This says the opposite of what Snyder states. So Snyder probably meant Herf, 93. There, Herf writes, the replacement of the Jewish foreign minister Maxim Litvinov by Vyshelov, Molotov, had signaled the end of Soviet support for Popular Front anti-fascism. As the historians of the Soviet Union Mikhail Heller and Alexander Neckrich put it, for the first time since the founding of the Soviet state, anti-Semitism was becoming official policy. End quote. Soviet policy was becoming officially anti-Semitic? What is Herf's evidence for such a serious accusation? Herf's footnote is to Heller and Neckrich, Utopia and Power, New York, 1986, page 364. But there the search for evidence ends for Heller and Neckrich. Visceral haters of Stalin have no evidence at all to support this statement. Here is what Jeffrey Roberts, one of the best academic historians of the Stalin period in the West, says, quote, why did Stalin choose to replace Litvinov at such a critical moment? A common interpretation is that it was a prelude to the pact with Nazi Germany signed in August 1939. The problem with this explanation is that far from abandoning the Triple Alliance negotiations with Britain and France, Molotov pursued them with even more vigor than Litvinov. The most likely explanation is that Molotov's appointment was connected to Litvinov's failure to make any headway in the negotiations. Roberts, Molotov, page 21. End quote. As Roberts concludes, Snyder, Herf, Heller, and Neckrich are all wrong. In fact, the opposite was the case. Molotov was the closest person to Stalin in the Soviet leadership. His appointment signaled redoubled Soviet efforts to get collective security, guarantees from Britain and France that they would fight Germany if the USSR did. These talks only failed in the end because the British envoy, Admiral Drax, arrived in the USSR by slow boat and without any authority to sign any agreement. There is no evidence that any desire to indulge Hitler had anything to do with Litvinov's replacement. Snyder appears to recognize this in a vague way in the following paragraph. Quote, "The alternative to a German orientation, an alliance with Great Britain and France, seemed to offer little. London and Paris had granted security guarantees to Poland in March 1939 to try to deter a German attack, and tried thereafter to bring the Soviet Union into some kind of defensive coalition, but Stalin was quite aware that London and Paris were unlikely to intervene in Eastern Europe if Germany attacked Poland or the Soviet Union." End quote. Once again, Snyder is completely wrong in claiming that London and Paris had tried to bring the Soviet Union into some kind of defensive coalition. In reality, just the opposite was the case. The USSR had tried to negotiate a mutual defense pact with the UK and France. This attempt foundered because the British did not want it and the French went along with the UK. The transcript of the negotiations between the British, French, and Soviet representatives was published in the Soviet Union in 1955 in 2 successive issues of the Soviet journal International Life. The texts are available online in Russian, including the August 12, 1939 session, during which British Admiral Drax admits that he has no powers to conclude any agreement. The August 16th telegram from French Foreign Minister Bonnet to the French Ambassador Poland Noel, insisting that he make clear to the Poles that they're agreeing to allow Soviet troops to cross Polish territory to engage German forces, is absolutely essential for any collective security agreement. Polish Foreign Minister Joseph Beck's August 20th telegram to Julius Lukasiewicz, Polish ambassador to France, declaring that Poland refuses any military agreements with the Soviet Union. This is the document that definitively sabotaged any collective security agreement, thus guaranteeing both the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and Poland's defeat in September 1939. A Polish source states that this document was sent to Polish ambassador to London, Edward Rydzyński, rather than to Lukasiewicz, and gives the Polish original as follows, of which the Russian text is a faithful translation. The French and English ambassadors have approached me as a result of negotiations of the Franco-Anglo-Soviet staffs, during which the Soviets demanded the possibility of entering into contact with the German army in the Pomoravsk, Suwalszczyzna, and in eastern Little Poland, i.e. western Belarusia and the western Ukraine, Grover Furr. This position is supported by an English and French démarche. I responded that it is impermissible that these states discussed the question of the military use of the territory of another sovereign state. No military treaties bind Poland with the Soviets, and the Polish government does not intend to conclude a treaty of this kind. The French ambassador said that in that case, they will reply to the Soviets that the Polish government has refused any discussion, or that the French government has not undertaken a formal démarche, since it is certain of a negative reply. I leave the question of a response to the Soviets to France and England, with the stipulation that the answer not give any reason for misunderstanding Beck. This was the direct cause of the failure of collective security against German aggression. It was thereby also the direct cause of the German invasion of Poland. Hitler feared a two-front war, his general staff even more so. He would not have invaded had collective security been established, and it would have been established except for England and Poland. In his interview in Izvestia of August 27, 1939, Marshal Voroshilov put it this way, quote, "The Soviet military mission considered that the USSR, having no common frontier with an aggressor, can render assistance to France, Great Britain, and Poland only if its troops will be allowed to pass through Polish territory, because there is no other way for Soviet troops to establish contact with the aggressor's troops. Just as the British and American troops in the past World War would have been unable to participate in military collaboration with the French armed forces if they had no possibility of operating in French territory, the Soviet armed forces could not participate in military collaboration with armed forces of France and Great Britain if they are not allowed access to Polish territory. Despite the fact that this position is obviously correct, the French and English military missions did not agree with this position of the Soviet mission, and the Polish government openly declared that they did not need and would not accept military help from the USSR. This circumstance made military collaboration between the USSR and these countries impossible. This is the basis of the disagreements. Over this, the negotiations have been broken off. Footnote. Translation of the first two paragraphs of Voroshailov's statement is taken from Soviet Explains Break with Allies, New York Times, August 27, 1939, page 28. End of footnote. There is also good evidence that Beck had been well paid by the Germans to act in their interest, that he was in fact a German agent. Snyder falsifies the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact. Snyder states, quote, "The two regimes immediately found common ground in their mutual aspiration to destroy Poland." End quote, page 116. In fact, the very opposite is the truth. Far from destroying Poland, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was intended to guarantee the continued existence of Poland in case the German army overran it. Here is the test of the secret protocol to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Quote, Article 2. In the event of a territorial and political rearrangement of the areas belonging to the Polish state, the spheres of influence of Germany and the USSR shall be bounded approximately by the line of the rivers Narev, Vistula, and San. The question of whether the interests of both parties make desirable the maintenance of an independent Polish state, and how such a state should be bounded, can only be definitely determined in the course of further political development. End quote. Footnote. From Paul Halsall's Modern History Sourcebook, Fordham University. Can be found at fordham.edu. End of footnote. By this secret protocol, as long as an independent Polish state continued to exist, it would be east of the Narev, Vistula-San line, and Germany could not occupy it. That would be desirable for the USSR. Such a rump Polish state would A. provide a buffer between German troops and the Soviet border, and B. be hostile to Germany, and more likely to agree to a mutual defense treaty with the USSR, something that, as we have seen, Poland rejected as late as August 1939, less than a month before the Polish-German War. But no one had foreseen that the Polish government would abandon its country without appointing a successor government, thus leaving Poland without any government at all, without any command for the military, and without any entity with which to negotiate a surrender. Hitler had the pretext, and in fact a good case in international law, to take the position that Poland as a state no longer existed. German declaration that Poland as a state no longer existed amounted to a threat to repudiate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which concerned the Polish state. If Germany insisted there was no Polish state any longer, it was free to send its troops hundreds of miles further to the east, to the borders of western Ukraine and the western Belarusia, and this is exactly what happened. Hitler's government stopped referring to Poland and began referring to in the area lying to the east of the German zone of influence. The USSR could not stand by while Hitler's army rolled up to its pre-1939 borders. No state in the world would have acted this way, nor did international law demand it. This compelled the USSR to enter the former Polish state in order to prevent the German army from marching up to the 1939 Soviet border. Chapter 7 of the present book is devoted to a more detailed examination of the issue of the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact and questions related to it. Snyder fabricates a justification for mass murder by Stalin. Quote, "The irony was that Stalin had very recently justified the murder of more than 100,000 of his own citizens by the false claim that Poland had signed just such a secret codicil with Germany under the cover of a non-aggression pact." End quote, page 116. This statement is just another outright falsification by Snyder. Stalin never made any such statement, and naturally Snyder does not cite a shred of evidence that he did. Snyder begins his false account of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Quote, "Officially, the agreement signed in Moscow on the 23rd of August 1939 was nothing more than a non-aggression pact. In fact, Ribbentrop and Molotov also agreed to a secret protocol designating areas of influence for Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union within Eastern Europe, in what were still the independent states of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania. Now the Soviet Union had agreed to attack Poland along with Germany." End quote, page 116. This is a lie. We have quoted the secret protocol above. It contains no agreement whatever to attack Poland at all, ever, much less along with Germany. Of course, Snyder cannot cite any evidence in support of his statement here. Throughout the rest of his book and in many of his articles, Snyder writes about the alliance between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. For example, quote, the Nazi-Soviet alliance, the union between Moscow and Berlin, page 116 to 117. 2 days after the Soviet military victory over Japan on 17 September 1939, the Red Army invaded Poland from the east. The Red Army and the Wehrmacht met in the middle of the country and organized a joint victory parade. Page 117. End quote. All these statements are false, and of course, Snyder has no evidence to support any of them. 1. There was no Nazi-Soviet alliance. Snyder repeats this over and over again, but it never existed. So of course he has no evidence that it did, nor was there any union between Moscow and Berlin. 2. The Red Army did not invade Poland. It sent troops into the former Polish state only after the Germans had informed the USSR that there was no longer any Poland. This meant that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was no longer in effect because it was a pact concerning Poland, and Germany considered that Poland no longer existed. Germany told the Soviets that if they did not send in troops, new states would be formed in western Belarusia and western Ukraine. That meant a pro-Nazi Ukrainian nationalist state, as the Soviets no doubt knew. Given this situation, the Soviets had no choice but to send in the Red Army. No state in the world would have permitted the German Wehrmacht to march right up to its borders without taking some kind of action to prevent it. 3. There was no joint victory parade. In the next chapter, we will expose in detail Snyder's lies about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and related issues. Quote, by opening half of Poland to the Soviet Union, Hitler would allow Stalin's terror, so murderous in the Polish operation, to recommence within Poland itself. Thanks to Stalin, Hitler was able in occupied Poland to undertake his first policies of mass killing. In the 21 months that followed the joint German-Soviet invasion of Poland, the Germans and the Soviets would kill Polish civilians in comparable numbers for similar reasons, as each ally mastered its half of occupied Poland. End quote. Page 117 to 118. Every one of these statements is false. Naturally, Snyder has no evidence for any of them. The Polish operation was not Stalin's terror. The many murders in the Polish operation were carried out by Azov in pursuit of his conspiracy against the Soviet government and party. Stalin had nothing to do with them. This is well demonstrated by the evidence we have. At least one expert, though highly anti-communist historian, Kaustov, has admitted that this is what happened. The USSR did not carry out any terror in Poland at all. As we shall see, Snyder is unable to find any evidence of such a terror. To say that Hitler's mass killing was thanks to Stalin is the reverse of the truth. As though Hitler would not have killed Poles if he had occupied all of Poland instead of just the western half. On the contrary, he would have killed many more Poles if he had had the whole country under his control. Hitler's conquest of Poland and the subsequent mass killings of Polish citizens were the direct result of the Polish government's rejection of collective security, and then of their abandonment of their own country, leaving it without any government. The Polish government must share with Hitler the responsibility for the immense death and destruction visited upon Poland by Hitler. The Polish regime's refusal either to agree to collective security with the USSR or to avoid war with Germany by yielding to Hitler's demands, more German rights in Danzig and a corridor to it and to East Prussia, was suicidal. No one believed that the Polish army could stand up to the German army unaided, yet the Polish regime flatly refused any alliance with the Red Army, the only military force that could have intervened in a timely manner if Germany should attack Poland, as in fact it did. The Polish government made the situation qualitatively worse by committing an unprecedented act of cowardice. The government, along with the military leaders, abandoned the country and crossed the border to internment in Romania. Since Romania was neutral in the war, it had to intern the Polish government rather than permit it to operate safely on Romanian soil, or be guilty of a hostile act against Germany. Moreover, the Polish government failed to appoint a successor government either within Poland or in exile before fleeing into Romania and being interned. Once interned, the former Polish government figures could not perform any governmental functions. That meant that there was no Polish government and no one with whom Hitler could negotiate. It also meant that the Polish army, parts of which were still fighting, Warsaw had not yet fallen to the Germans, for example, no longer had a legitimate commander. Therefore, as a state, Poland had ceased to exist. No other government in World War II acted in this manner. Naturally, one could also blame the governments of Great Britain and France who failed to honor their obligation to attack Germany if Germany attacked Poland. Their actions proved that Soviet suspicions were correct. The Western Allies were not inclined to hinder Hitler as long as he kept moving east towards the hated Soviet Union. Even Winston Churchill acknowledged that the Soviet Union was correct to enter Poland rather than allow the German army to march right up to the pre-1939 Soviet border. In his radio speech of October 1st, 1939, printed in the New York Times on October 2nd, 1939, page 6, Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, said, quote, "Russia has pursued a cold policy of self-interest. We could have wished that the Russian armies should be standing on their present line as the friends and allies of Poland, but that the Russian armies should stand on this line was clearly necessary for the safety of Russia against the Nazi menace." End quote. Churchill also agreed that it was in the interests of the Allies to have the Red Army occupying these territories. Quote, "Here, these interests of Russia fall into the same channel as the interests of Britain and France." End quote. The Soviets declared their neutrality in the German-Polish War. Their neutrality was accepted by every state as well as by the League of Nations. The Soviets killed no Polish civilians in the following 21 months, let alone for comparable reasons to Hitler's. Hitler's reason was the extermination of Slavs. The part of Poland occupied by the Soviet Union had been seized by Poland in an imperialist war in 1919 to 1920. Poles were a minority among the population. The Western Allies immediately recognized that Poland had no claim to these territories and they would not be returned to Poland after the war ended. Since 1939, these same lands have been part of Belarus and Ukraine and remain so today. The Polish government no longer claims that these lands are a part of Poland or should be returned to Poland. End of chapter 5.